So welcome everyone to our webinar this morning, which is all about propagating plants with Kat Lavers, who I'll introduce in just a moment. I hope you've been enjoying, had a beautiful morning, slightly warmer in Melbourne this morning, so it looks like we're in for a beautiful day. My name is Beck Nichols and I work for the City of Stonington in the Sustainable Environment team, and I've organised today in this series of webinars. Before I do start, I do really want to start by acknowledging that whilst we are joining from right across Melbourne, Victoria and even the country, we are meeting on the lands of the traditional owners, and I do want to pay my respects to elders past, present and also emerging, and recognise the cultural heritage of this land. And I live and at the moment also work, spend all my time on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And do just feel so grateful and proud that Wurundjeri people are still here, still caring for and still speaking up for the country and for their people. And obviously that's existed for so many thousands of years. So I'm proud to have that heritage continue. Let's get some mutes going. I think that's happening. There we go. So we have had over 500 people register for today's webinar, which is huge. It's definitely been the most popular webinar of all of these sessions. So it'll be interesting to see how many people are tuning in and how many people watch the recording. I've been really excited about this one, as I feel like propagation is just one of those skills that once mastered might even mean that I'll never have to buy seedlings again. So we'll see about that. But this webinar is part of a series of online events that we're running in May and June to help you live more sustainably and take climate action from home. And the series is a partnership between Stonington Council and also the cities of Yarra, Port Phillip and Glen Eira. The series is our response to the pandemics, to people spending more time at home and learning new skills of self-sufficiency. And through the series, we're aiming to help you learn new skills and knowledge to help you reduce your costs, reduce emissions and use resources carefully to be more sustainable at home. And it really is clear that so many of us have turned during this time to our gardens, and I'm really delighted to be able to support this through today's webinar. Before we do start, I do just want to preface that this webinar and this series is also part of a much wider program of events and part of a much wider strategy for the City of Stonington to support our community to live more sustainably and reduce emissions. And Stonington Council is really seriously committed to sustainability. We see our role as a local government as an important one in supporting our community to reduce their impact. And of course, we must also reduce our footprint as an organisation and lead the way for our community. And of course, this is becoming more important and urgent than ever before, and really we're already feeling the impacts of climate change in so many ways, but especially including extreme weather events like fires and floods and droughts and storms. So I do quickly just want to highlight some of the key ways in which Stonington Council is taking action on climate change. So we're setting really strong emissions reduction targets, and we're on track to achieve them. We've installed solar on every council rooftop, and we're supporting the community to install solar and reduce energy as well. We're protecting and enhancing biodiversity and our natural environment through planting thousands of plants and trees every single year. And we're also really committed to supporting our community to grow sustainable and productive gardens in lots of different ways, through events like this one, through gardening and composting workshops, tree planting days, biodiversity tours. We've got discounting composting products, and I'll tell you more about this at the end. And also a big annual event called Spring into Gardening, which you're all invited to. And while I've just highlighted some of our work today at Council, has also made a commitment to take further and more immediate action to respond to the climate emergency. And we declared a climate emergency in February this year. If you do live in Stonington and have ideas on what our climate emergency response could look like, we'd love to hear from you. We've got an online consultation process running at the moment, which I'll tell you a little bit more about at the end. And of course, you can find out about all of Stonington Council's programs through our environmental newsletter. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before we launch into things. This webinar will run for 2 hours until 12 o'clock. We will have time to take questions throughout, and there are a few ways to ask your questions. So you can do this through the chat box. Just look for the little speech bubble and you can type out your question. Or you can also raise your hand through Zoom as a function, and then we can hand the microphone over to you and you can ask your question. And yeah, we'll do our best to get through all the questions, but we've had so many questions throughout these webinars. So if we may not get to all of them, but we'll do our best. This webinar will be recorded, and I will share a link with you at the end of this webinar in the follow-up email. If you're not comfortable having your face shared in the recording, just a reminder to switch off your camera. But we do love to see your faces if you're happy to be part of it. Kat has compiled some notes on the session, so we'll also share them after the webinar. You don't have to record your notes furiously. I think we'll be pausing for a little quick break at halftime so you can grab a cuppa or stretch your legs. And I also want to introduce you guys to Andriana Kersar from Glen Ira Council, who's working away in the background and helping manage all of your questions. So big thanks to Andriana. All right, before I introduce Kat, I do just want to, we've got some polls and I would just love to get a little lay of the land of who's joining. So I'm just going to launch a poll and you should see something come up on your screen. And I think you can answer both of these questions at the same time. Is that right, Kat?
I've actually got no idea. This is the first time I've ever done a poll.
Okay,
brand new experiment for us.
I can see 2 polls. So yes, looks like you can answer both. So we'll give you just another 20 seconds or so to get your answers in. It's really cool. I can see how many of you have voted. So coming up to 70%. It's pretty cool function. I really like the polls. Cool, we've got 93%. Get those last few votes in. Cool, and I might end it here. All right, so what kind of garden do you have? Right, so most people have a pretty big garden, either large or medium. Awesome. A few smaller gardens and a couple with indoor. Awesome. And where are we at with our gardening? So we've got 50%, around about 50% sitting right in the middle. So not quite a green thumb, but definitely not a beginner. That's awesome to know. And then probably way closer to the beginner's end, just more generally. I should have shared them with you so you can see what I'm talking about. There we go. All right, well, now that we've done that, I will definitely introduce our presenter for today, who is Kat Lavers, who, for those who don't know Kat, she's a passionate gardener and sustainable food systems advocate. Kat has a background in permaculture design, teaching and facilitation, and as you'll learn today, her work connects people with the land under their feet and helps us all understand our role in a wider ecosystem. So over to you, Kat.
Thank you so much, Beck. Good morning, everyone. It's really such a treat to be able to be spending time with people who share your passion over these last few weeks. Before I say anything else, I want to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri land this morning. And of course, all traditional owners of land have a very close and long interaction with plants and have propagated plants and shared them and improved them over thousands of years. So we're extremely lucky to be in the land of the oldest living culture on earth. So it's so important to acknowledge that, particularly at the moment, of course, with everything that's going on in the world. Okay, so this morning, of course, we're talking about propagation. So I thought I'll just be really upfront about my background with propagation. I'm a home food gardener, predominantly food gardener, although I do have some native plants and some functional plants which aren't necessarily food producers but also support my food producing plants by bringing in pollinators and predatory insects and other helpful interactions. And I don't have any formal training in propagation, and it's quite possible that some of you do out there, which is fantastic. So if you do have your own tricks and techniques and things that you'd like to share, one of the best things that can happen in these sessions when we've got more than 100 people is that you start popping those in the chat window as well and contribute them. And then I get to learn as well. So having said I've got no formal experience, I am coming from a position of growing a lot of the fresh produce. In fact, most of the fresh produce for our household, with a couple of exceptions. And I do that as much as possible through propagating my own plants. Although I've read a fair bit about more, I guess, intensive specialised propagation techniques, the ones that I actually end up using to do what I want to do, which I presume is a reason why many of you are here, which is, you know, growing your own garden and maybe food producing plants. The actual techniques that I'm using there are fairly low tech and simple. And so the real focus of today's session for me is going over in some detail really the most useful and most accessible techniques for home gardeners. And I was taking close note of the polls that we've just done, and I'm noticing that most people have got a medium amount of experience, but we do have some complete beginners in here as well. And with all my teaching, I prefer to have a leave no one behind policy. And so I'm not going to assume any prior knowledge in there. So I just ask for a little bit of patience if you're in the more experienced end, and again, jump in with your own thoughts and tips and so on. And if you are coming from the perspective of being a complete beginner, if you're brave enough to ask a question, there's going to be 20 other people who are so grateful that you had the guts to ask it. So just please don't let me skip over anything that is unclear. And I'm quite happy to go into more depth or repeat anything that you need to feel really confident at the end of this session that you can just go straight outside and start trying some of these techniques. So that's my goal for today. And as we just had a quick discussion about before the session started, I'm going to focus predominantly on food plants. Most of these techniques are very, very transferable to ornamentals, possibly to natives as well. I have propagated some native plants using these techniques. It's just not an area of speciality for me. So yeah, mostly on vegetable and food plants. But yeah, we'll see where we can take it from there. So what I'm going to do now is jump into some photographs, and then I can start sharing with you some of these fabulous and accessible techniques. So bear with me while I find that screen in Zoom. Here we go. Beck, can you just give me a thumbs up if that's working? Beautiful. Okay, so propagation, beginner's guide. These are the techniques that we will be focusing on today. Seeds, division, cuttings, runners and suckers, and layering. And straight up, seeds are probably the most technical one, and the one where there are just so many things that can happen that can catch you out as a beginner. So we'll spend probably most of the time on seeds and then go through the other techniques after that. What is a seed, first of all? This is a really lovely thing to start understanding. What is this little package that we call a seed? And at its core, I guess, a seed is like an embryonic plant. And there's a lovely, lovely quote, and I wish I could remember where I heard it, but I can't, so we'll just have to roll with it. A baby plant asleep with its lunch. And that really gets to the heart of it. There is an embryonic plant, and there is also enough food for that plant to start growing and get out its leaves, which are like its solar panels, which are able to then provide more energy, more food. And of course the plant is asleep, so it's in a dormant phase until something comes along and activates it. And just make sure you're on mute, folks, so we get a little bit of background noise there. Thank you. So what we can see in the picture here is the process of a seed starting to grow. And this is just helpful for people getting started to have a bit of a visual on what's going to happen when you plant it in the ground. So something will trigger that germination, whether it's temperature or moisture or combination of many factors. That seed is going to start to swell up or imbibe or drink up the moisture around it. And then we'll start to see a little shoot or a root or technically a radicle, it's called, coming out of that seed. The roots form first. So you don't see leaves immediately. It's got to form roots before that starts to happen. So once the root starts to get established, then we start to see the seed popping out of the ground. And the lunch for the plant is actually the two halves of the seed. If we were to split it in half, like imagine a bean seed, for example, and the two halves there. So those two halves are what we kind of see as the first leaves, but they're not what we call true leaves. They're just the lunch for that plant on its way to becoming an adult. So the green leaves that you can see here in the slide, the more beany looking leaves that I'm circling with my mouse, they are what we call the true leaves, the first true leaves of the plant. Once they're up, the plant is then taking in energy from the sun, and we're away and hopefully on our way to some beautiful crops. So we'll kind of refer back to some of these things. Don't worry about all the complicated names, just that general concept of roots coming first and then having true leaves emerge sometime afterwards. Now, Beck asked me to pop in just a little quick example of saving your own seeds. And I guess this is a bit of a teaser for a much longer session that we don't currently have scheduled in there. But seed saving, if you can learn to do seed saving, that is really the key to more of a kind of a self-sufficient approach to plant propagation. You can go and buy seeds, and there's lots of great reasons to still be propagating from bought seeds. But for me, when you save the seeds, that's where the gold is, because that's when you start to get varieties that are really closely adapted to your tastes, to your soil, to your microclimate in your garden. You'll get tons of seed that you can then be sharing with your friends and your neighbours. And over time, you can even slowly start to breed your own seeds. And that's a really, really exciting thing that many home gardeners get quite into after a while. So I'll just leave that, I guess, that little teaser there for people who want to then go and explore saving some of their own seeds. I wanted to show you how simple it can be though. So what you can see in front of you here is the easiest way I know to save seeds, which is getting a really yummy tomato that's very ripe. So you don't want an underripe fruit because the seeds might not be fully developed. And then taking that really soft ripe tomato and squashing it all over a piece of a kitchen towel and then letting that kitchen towel dry. And that's what you can see in front of you here. And once it's fully dry, it's as simple as writing the name of the tomato, where you saved it and the year, and then stashing that away in your seed box. And believe it or not, you can actually propagate your tomatoes by just tearing off a piece of paper with the seed attached and popping it in your seed raising mix or in the soil that we're about to talk about. And away you go. And of course that paper will decompose. So you'll just be left with a tomato plant there. So that's a really, really simple technique. It doesn't get much easier than that for seed saving. And of course, there are other ways that you can save seed as well. And I made a little video, so I'm going to stop sharing this slide for a second and bring that up. And Zoom sometimes does a thing where you have to close all of your videos before you can show the right one. And unfortunately, it's doing that. So I will just close some videos in the background. Try not to end the whole Zoom meeting. Just bear with me for 1 minute. The very annoying feature of Zoom when I have about 6 videos lined up to show you. Let me see. That one. Okay, I'm going to try that again. All right. So hopefully you can see a bowl there with some seeds in it. Beck, let me know if that's not the case because sometimes it shows the wrong video. Anyway, so here is a way that you can save some of the seeds that you might see in the garden that are starting to form and drying out. This technique works with lots and lots of different seed types. So once you get the principle, you can hopefully adapt that.
simple.
Okay, so there you go. Sorry that was a little bit choppy. I'm not quite sure why Zoom didn't like that video, but hopefully what you're able to see, if I go back through some of the slides, what I'm doing here is just rubbing that seed into the bowl. So any seed that is kind of dried out on the plant and you think you can kind of rub it out, you can use this technique of just rubbing it between your hands until it falls into the bowl. Then when that's done, you'll see we've got all this chaff, or the casing of the seeds. And what we can do is just shake the bowl a little bit, which will usually drop the seeds to the bottom because they're a bit heavier. Then you can start taking out some handfuls of that chaff like I'm doing here and getting that away. Once we've done that, we shake it a little bit more, keep shaking the bowl during this process. And then I'm tilting the bowl, as you can see here, and using my breath and just blowing to blow off some of that chaff. And this is a really ancient process of cleaning up seed, and it's called winnowing. It's a really lovely thing to do. And if we did a longer seed saving session, I'd show you a little bit more. But just using your breath alone, you can blow off the last of that chaff and leave yourself with quite clean seed. There you go. So the people who are asking, this is wild rocket seed, which is a type of brassica seed. I know there's a couple of questions on seed here, which we might be able to catch at the end. We're not going to spend a lot of time on seed saving in this session, as I said, but I just wanted to pop in a little teaser to encourage you to go out and try that if it's something that you haven't tried yet. Mary, I can see your question about paper towel, and yes, it should be plastic free, so it just breaks down like anything else that you put in the compost. So there you go, a little bit on seed saving there, just to get us started. And now at this stage, I will jump back in and start talking about the process that we use to save or to start growing some of these seeds that we've saved. Now, there's two ways that we can start sowing seeds. One of them is what we call direct sowing. So that is sowing them directly into the place where they're going to mature as plants. So that would be like a garden bed, or it could be a pot if you're gardening on a balcony on a much smaller scale. Direct sowing is something that we technically could use for all seeds, but think of your garden out there a bit like the Wild West. There's a lot going on out there. There could be birds, there could be slugs, there could be earwigs, there could be blazing hot sun one day. So it's a more challenging environment for smaller seeds to get established. And so we tend to reserve it for seeds that are a bit larger, and usually that means a little bit more robust. And we also use direct sowing for crops where we eat the roots, because roots can get very messed around in the process of transplanting them from punnets, which we'll look at next, into their soil. So you can see here some examples of things that you would usually sow directly into their final position. Beans and peas are definitely in this group because many of them have a taproot that can snap when they're transplanted, and that will mean that your plant doesn't mature as well or produce as much as it would otherwise. Radish, I put them in here actually just because they're so easy, and they seem to have their own pest defense system because of the spiciness, so they're a little bit more robust. Carrots, of course, we eat the carrot's roots, and if that root gets twisted, well, you can imagine the kind of carrots that you end up with. So carrots, if you want nice long straight ones, are usually better grown direct sown. Something else that I would put in this category, and something that causes a lot of despair in home gardeners, is coriander. And there are some plants which are just so fragile that if you try and transplant them from seedling punnets into the ground, they can immediately go to seed, or what we call bolt. And that means that they just take off and they skip most of their adult life and go straight into producing flowers and seed and then dying. And I've had such better success with coriander since I started direct sowing it rather than trying to grow it in punnets first. So direct sowing, I have another video that I'd like to show you, just a really quick one of the process that I use. I should say actually for the whole session here that every gardener has their own technique for this. It's all slightly different, a few similar themes. So if you're doing something different and it's working, just keep doing it. But for people who are just starting, I wanted to show you what I do at home as something that you can use as a base to continue with your gardening. So I'm going to stop sharing again and see if I can pull up my direct sowing video that I filmed early this morning. And it's doing that annoying thing again where it won't let me have two videos at once. So I have to close my winnowing video and I have to open up my direct sowing video. Okay, here we go. So planting some coriander seed early this morning. Great. Okay, so simple video. Sorry about the wonky camera movement. What you saw me doing here is firstly creating a drill. So using the trowel to just scrape a little depression in the soil. Now, how deep that is, we're going to talk about in a minute, and that's very, very important. So for coriander, it's a fairly shallow drill, and we don't want the seed too far below the surface. Then you saw me drop the trowel. That's obviously very important. I have to drop something in all of your videos. Then we put the coriander seed in, and notice I'm just sprinkling it in there. I don't want it too thick because if these plants all come up close together, then that competition is going to weaken them. So I'm trying to scatter it, maybe double the thickness that I would prefer, and I might come back and do some thinning at the right spacings that I want these plants to grow on at in the future. Once I've sown them in there, then I'll come back over them and I sprinkle that or kind of pinch that soil closed over the top of them. And then I'm just coming back and firming that soil down with my hand so that there's nice contact between the soil and the seed. After this video, of course, I would water, and that will start the process of seed germination. So that's one way of doing it. And of course, you can also sprinkle soil over the top of them rather than pinching it closed. But it's as simple as that, really, the direct sowing technique. So I'll close that. And we'll come back to the slides. Cool. Okay, so I'm just checking a couple of questions. Okay, so I think we're going to come to those. So I'm going to keep going and just let me know if we don't cover off on those after the rest of the seed sowing session. So I'm going to talk now about sowing in punnets, and in this a lot of the advice will be the same for sowing direct in the ground as well, and hopefully we'll cover off on some of those questions about watering and spacing and so on. So sowing in punnets is sowing in something that's separate to the area where the plants want to grow as adults, and often, at least in Australia, we tend to use these plastic punnets, and under no circumstances go out and buy these. There are crates and crates just full of these at most nurseries, and many nurseries have recycling programs for these now. And I think in some council areas you can also put these in your recycling bin, but a much better idea is to actually take them and reuse them and just use them basically until they break, which can be a very, very long time. Now, punnets come in different shapes and sizes, of course, and everyone's got their own preferences. I wanted to show you my preference, and my preference is to use the deeper ones where I can, because this little shoot that I've got here on the right-hand side is a lettuce seedling after about 1 week. So have a look at the long root that's on that lettuce. and imagine how scrunched up it will feel if it's trapped inside a much smaller punnet. So I do actually use these smaller punnets on the left-hand side here for small plants, including lettuce, but where I can get the space for them in my seed raising area, I try and use these deeper ones, which allow a bit more root development before we move into the final planting position. In the smaller punnets, I will usually do about 6 to 8 holes, but in the larger punnets where I'm planting larger plants, like this little cucumber example, I might do 3 or 4 plants. So acknowledging that the larger seeds are a bit more reliable and we won't need quite so many of them to ensure that we get one strong one. Okay, some of the advantages of sowing in punnets are that you have a lot more control. It's not the Wild West, and you can choose where you put them. Usually that means you can manipulate the temperature of them a little bit better by moving them around, bringing them inside even if you have to. You can put them in an area which is quite clear of many pests. So up on a seed raising bench, for example, you can be quite sure that there aren't too many slugs or snails lurking around. And you can also control the water a little bit more easily. Rather than watering a large vegetable bed and keeping that moisture perfect while the seeds germinate, you can shrink that area down to maybe even a square foot and just keep that area moist on your seed raising bench. Okay, as I said, use the larger punnets, especially for those larger vegetables. Now, what do we put in them? That's of course the million-dollar question. And I want to acknowledge here that my experience so far differs a little bit from the standard horticultural advice that's out there in most of the textbooks. So I'll give you both and you can have a play at home and decide which one you like better. The classic horticultural advice is to invest in premium seed raising mix and or potting mix, depending on whether you're growing slightly larger, chunkier plants or seeds. And that premium potting mix has this red label in Australia. And I do agree with that. There's a very large spectrum of things that are called potting mix. And it's one of those things where you often get what you pay for. So this red tick label, if you are buying a commercial seed raising or potting mix, is something to look out for. Now, many people I know go out and buy a commercial seed raising mix and think this is it. This is going to be the best possible chance that I have of getting good seedlings. And I'd love to know your experiences, by the way, if you want to pop them in that chat box. What I've personally found with commercial seed raising mix is it's extremely prone to drying out and it doesn't have a lot of its own nutrient. And so moisture and a little bit of nutrient once the seed has emerged are quite key to having healthy seedlings. So what commercial seed raising mix is really, really good at is providing a nice texture that has great drainage and so doesn't get very soggy if you water it. So that's fantastic. But those two other areas are real downsides for home gardeners. They're fantastic if you're in a commercial nursery and you've got sprinklers that are misting these seedlings a couple of times throughout the day, and you may be fertilizing them with the liquid fertilizer or something like that as well, sometimes in the water. They're not really good for home gardeners who sometimes can only water once or twice a day maximum and need to go out of their house and go to work and do other things, especially in hot weather where everything's drying out really fast. Let me know if that sounds familiar or not, because yeah, it's really good to get your feedback. So the alternative to that is to add something to that mix. And so I've been adding compost or worm castings. And these ingredients hold water. They're very good at holding more than their own weight in water. And they also provide some nutrients. So in other words, they balance out some of the shortfalls of that commercial seed raising mix. But there is a downside, of course. They can have weed seeds and they can have pests and possibly some diseases as well. So you've got a little bit of a choice to make here. So if you are concerned that you won't be able to recognise a weed seed as opposed to your vegetable seeds, you may want to use a commercial compost product. And if you do go out and buy one, the commercial worm castings, or what's called vermicast, would be my choice. Really, really good in this context. You could also, if you wanted to, kind of pasteurize your own soil or your own compost or worm castings using your oven. That won't be everyone's cup of tea, but technically if you bake them at say about 70 degrees for an hour, then you won't have any weed seeds or pests popping up out of them. Feel free to make up your own mind about what you want to try, being aware of some of the strengths and weaknesses of both of these mixes. My personal choice for my own seed raising mix is to use about 1 part compost or worm castings to about 3 parts sandy soil, commercial seed raising mix, or if it's a very chunky plant or like a cutting or a big seed, I could even use potting mix here. If I've bought something from a nursery, I actually reuse the seed raising and potting mix that it comes in for other propagation. But if I don't have any of that around that I've salvaged, I actually use my own garden soil. So that's an amazing cost saving, and also saves a lot of plastic that these things come packaged in, because I can literally just dig out some of my veggie patch soil, add a little bit of worm castings to it, and then have a brilliant seed raising mix. And so that's my choice. If you want to use your own soil, it can't be soil that clumps together like a clayey soil. It just won't work. You might be able to add some sand to it to improve that drainage and help it to be looser. Or maybe you can get a bucket of someone else's sandy soil who lives in a different area. Either way, the characteristics we need are a mix that feels quite loose and light. It can hold on to a bit of water without being soggy, and it also has a little bit of nutrient in it as well to help those seeds once they've germinated. Now, I'm just trying to scan the chat window quickly and see if there's any things that we need to discuss relating to this. Okay, yeah, there is a comment on peat moss in there. Peat moss doesn't come from sustainable sources. So although a lot of gardeners swear by it in their own DIY seed raising mixes, I try pretty hard to steer clear of it. There are some recipes on the internet that involve coconut coir, which is probably a more sustainable alternative, but it's certainly not local for people who are living in Melbourne. So yeah, feel free to include other ingredients that are local to you and hopefully sustainably sourced, just keeping in mind that we need that balance of air and water and a little bit of nutrient as well. So that's my personal choice for DIY seed raising mix. Now we're going to go into how to sow seeds, and I made a video, a better quality video this time, that I'm going to share with you when I can open it up. Beck, just let me know if there's any on-topic questions as we go through these.
Someone did ask, I can't remember who, but where you grow or where you propagate, like in a warm room in your house or greenhouse or just outside.
That's definitely coming up. So yeah, you're
cool.
Absolutely on the money, and I've got some photographs to show you of that quite soon. Okay, so made a quick little video. Zoom is being very annoying, sorry.
I love that Lisa's had a light bulb moment.
Oh, good.
Talking about creating your own seed raising mix. It's amazing.
It was a bit of a light bulb moment for me as well when I started playing around. And for me, it's a good example of how you should absolutely read what's out there in terms of proper advice and listening to people with lots of experience, but you also shouldn't feel afraid to just try things out and see if they work, because sometimes you get a nice surprise. And I've always tried to take the approach of doing the simplest and cheapest and most sustainable thing possible and seeing if that works. And if it doesn't, just try making incremental changes until I can get something that does work. And this is one of those examples for you. Okay, so I think I've done it. Hopefully you've got that little seedling punnet in front of you now. Brilliant. And okay, so this is just showing you the video of how I sow my seeds. Okay, there you go. So I'll go through this, just point out a few features as we go through. Anne-Marie's commenting on my clean nails. Yep, only clean because I have to hold a camera in one hand. I assure you they're not usually that clean. All right, so we've got the mix here, and this one is actually some reused potting and seed raising mix combined together with some worm castings, and it's got a few chunks in it, and I'm okay with that, and I've had pretty good success even with a few larger pieces. If you've got a really chunky soil or potting mix, of course you could put it through a coarse sieve and try and get it slightly more even. And Haley's asked a question about washing your punnets for infection control. Haley, that's something that definitely, when you read up on propagation and commercial propagation, they're really big on, you know, even putting punnets in diluted bleach and things like that. In a home context, I don't think that's necessary, and especially not for seeds, which have their own kind of natural inbuilt protection. It might be something that you could look to if you wanted to increase your results for things like cuttings, where you've got a cut plant surface that is more prone to infection and things getting in. But certainly for seed saving in the home context, I don't think that is as important as some of the books would suggest. Okay, so that's the mix that you can see there. And I skip forward a little bit and see what happens next. So I've just pressed it down. When I scoop the potting mix into the seed raising punnet, I just level it off with my hand. So I brush the excess mix off, and then I will push it down a little bit. For years, I just did it with my fingers, but I actually recently have found a block of wood and found that that's actually quite a lot easier. The reason why we push it down slightly is just to firm it and make sure the seeds aren't going to move around too much when we water them. And again, we want nice close contact with the seed, so that it can drink up all the moisture from the soil and start to germinate evenly. Once you've got a nice firm even surface, then we're going to put some holes into that seed raising mix. And again, for this size punnet, often I use 8. If they were going to be larger plants or I didn't need as many, you could do 6. You don't have to do them in an even pattern, of course, but this is just the way that I do it. What I'd like you to pay attention to here is that I'm not poking very deep holes, and that's very important. So the rule of thumb is that we put the seed in about twice as deep as the width of the seed. Twice as deep as the width of the seed. And that's because little seeds only have a tiny packed lunch. So if they get buried really deep in the pot, they will use all their lunch and they will be starving by the time they reach the surface, and you will end up with weaker seedlings. So I tilted the punnet, I think, at some point here to show you. Well, go back a little bit. Just to show you that the depth of those little holes. So they're very tiny for the things like lettuce, which I'm putting in now. So then I'm putting in the lettuce, and I'm sowing it just by moving my fingers around and letting seeds drop out of them. If you don't have great dexterity with your fingers, which many people don't, you can use a chopstick with a slightly wet tip. So you can dip your chopstick into some water, and then you can dip it into your seeds, and then you can push the chopstick with seeds on the tip in the holes and drop some of them off. Oh, and I can see Michelle uses the chopstick to poke holes, which is awesome. So lots and lots of different ways of doing this. And yeah, so that way we just make sure we have a small number of seeds in each hole. For the smaller seeds, I typically go for about 2 or 3 in each hole. For larger seeds, we just have fewer holes overall, which I'm going to show you in a minute. But the key here is we don't want to flood those holes with lots and lots of seeds, because they will all compete with each other and they will be weaker as a result. So we want a couple as a backup in case 1 or 2 of them don't work, but we don't want lots and lots of seeds crowded together, because then we will need to thin them out in later steps, which is more work for us. So I'm popping the lettuce seeds in here. And then the next step is to come and close those holes over. Now, I deliberately am showing you 2 different ways of doing that here. One way is just to pinch them shut like I've done here, and again, firm that surface down. The other way, and it's particularly good if you've got lots and lots of seedlings, is you can just scatter a fine amount of the seed raising mix over the top. And you can do that sometimes by sieving it over the top if you've got a large number, or just using your hands like I've done there. I then, of course, label it, and it's extremely important. No matter how good your memory is, you will absolutely forget exactly what you planted. And the label, I don't know if anyone picked up what I'm using here. It's actually a piece of Venetian blind, and they turn out to be the perfect size to fit in these seed raising punnet holes. Just remarkable. And my friend Beck Lowe said to me once, if you see a Venetian blind, never let it get away. And it's true. So one Venetian blind is a lifetime supply of plant labels, and you can use them 4 times, back and front, top and bottom. By the time you finish using them, they've usually faded from the first one. So it just goes round and round and round. Absolutely brilliant. And really it's the 1 blind per person. So I've actually got 2 lifetime supplies of plant labels here, if anyone listening to me and needs some. So look out for those. And then right at the end, of course, we need to come in and water them. We are going to talk a lot more about water in a minute, and I'll show you how I've actually done that step. So there you go. Pop any questions about that in the chat window, and I will just jump back into my slides again. I realise this is possibly excruciating detail, but my experience has been that the devil is in the detail with seed saving, so I'm hoping that that is going down okay with you.
Kat, a bit of chat about cardboard and using egg shells, egg cartons or cardboard punnets.
Great. Yeah, so yeah, there are lots of other ways to do it. Yes, you can use egg cartons that are filled with soil. I wonder sometimes, there's 2 things about that. First one is they need to break down in time for those roots to come out and start moving into the soil once they're planted. So I think sometimes like a little hole in the base of each egg carton might help, just to make sure there is a way for roots to break through if the cardboard hasn't fully broken down yet, because it doesn't break down instantaneously. The other thing that I've noticed about making newspaper pots is that the paper seems to wick moisture away from that seed raising mix and can cause it to dry out faster, which is not necessarily a problem. It's just something to be aware of when you're managing the moisture. And I wonder if that's something other people have experienced as well. So feel free to let us know in the chat whether or not it works for you. Yes, yogurt containers and all those sorts of things I can see in the chat are brilliant as well. So you just need something that has a little bit of drainage in the bottom, and you can innovate and use all kinds of things that would otherwise be going to landfill, and it's great to do that. Okay, so a couple of other little tips on the seeds. Again, I've just got to repeat this one because it's such a key point. We sow seed about twice as deep as it is wide. And I know that they're not perfectly round, so you have to kind of estimate. If I'm picking up a pen, say the lettuce seed, we might plant it about that deep, roughly. And the bean seed, we might plant it about that deep. I'm hoping you can kind of see that. So you just guesstimate it, but the point is that we don't want to have it too deep, otherwise the plant won't be able to come up. Okay, next tip is if your seeds are very small, not always, but sometimes that means that they are a bit more fragile. And so I tend to sow a few more of them to compensate. Also, if the seeds are quite old, so you bought them a while ago, or if they haven't been stored very carefully, the seeds need a nice, cool, dark and dry environment to stay fertile for as long as possible. So if you know that seed is either old or hasn't been stored well, then again, I'd sow a few more. You will notice on seed packets that there are expiry dates, and I frequently sow things that are well past the expiry date just to try and get the most out of them that I can. But I will start just doubling the amount that I'm sowing or more as that seed starts to get very old. Sometimes it doesn't work, but often you'll get at least a few strong ones and enough to continue the next generation. Keeping them moist at all times deserves an exclamation mark here, and this is probably one of the main reasons that beginners fail. So moisture is just so important to these little seeds, and they really don't have much margin for error if they dry out. Of course, there's variability in seeds, but as a general rule, they really do need to be kept moist at all times once you've started the process of germination. I used to use a fancy spray bottle, and I'm pleased to report that was completely over the top and is not required. And I've actually moved to these very simple bottle top waterers now that I've made at home from something I picked up off the street. So this is just a standard water bottle. I've got a 1 litre one that I picked up as rubbish, and you can heat up a needle or a pin carefully over a flame and just poke it through that lid to make these holes. And it's beautiful and gentle. And the point here is we just don't want to blast seeds around in the punnet. So nice gentle stream of water. Now Vicky is one step ahead. She said, can you leave them in a shallow tray of water? And the answer is definitely, yes you can. Usually I'll water them with the bottle top waterer just to get them started, but I do use a little tray underneath them, especially when I'm getting seeds started in summer. So that's obviously a pretty tricky time to start seeds because they need a combination of very bright light, but also perfect moisture, which is very hard to achieve when it's 30 or 35 degrees. So here's what I do at home. I've got some old cat litter trays, which were picked up from hard rubbish and very carefully scrubbed out. And I fill them up with about 1 centimetre of water in the bottom. And that is like a kind of a wicking bed, really, for people who know the concept. That water will just drink up through the seedlings over the day. And it means I can leave them in pretty bright sun on a very hot day and still find them alive and thriving at the end. Okay, the next thing that seedlings need a lot of is extremely bright light. And it will actually surprise you how bright that light needs to be. They only need it during the daytime though, and they only need it once they've germinated. There are a couple of little exceptions to that, I should say. There are a small number of seeds that need to have light to germinate, and you'll work out what those are with some experience. Most of your common vegetable seeds though don't actually need light until they poke up above the soil surface. So here, this is my seed raising setup for the people who are asking me where I put them. You don't need something like this at home. In Melbourne's climate, you don't really need a greenhouse because we have a fairly gentle climate year round. A greenhouse does help you speed up seedling growth a little bit when it's still cold though. And when I picked this barbecue up off the side of the road, there were about 5 of them in the same street. And so we saved it from going to landfill and retrofitted it. If you want to try this, the shelf that they're on here is an old piece of supermarket shelving. You could use any kind of sturdy wire to take that place. And I attacked it with an angle grinder and cut these panels out of the lid. And that's a little bit of, this is actually proper greenhouse plastic, but you could use any thick plastic that comes wrapped around mattresses or, you know, other household goods. It's actually attached with a magnet, so I can replace it with shade cloth at times of year where I want a little bit more shelter for the seedlings. But what I actually love most about this is that it can move into shade and out of shade, and I can also work at a really ergonomic height, which is quite important when I'm out there doing a lot of things with seeds. Amy's got a question about a courtyard with laser light. And Amy, it's a great question, and I've also got a little area that's got laser light, and it would be a lovely spot to have my seeds, but I haven't found that it's enough light, unfortunately. So seedlings really do need to be really, really well lit. Otherwise you will see them starting to lean, and I'm going to show you that a little bit later on. So the seedlings will actually tell you whether they've got enough light or not, and just stay tuned for a little example of that. Jan says old ironing boards as potting benches. I love that idea. What a good one. Now, as I said, they only need this bright light during the daytime. So that means that at night time, if you want to, you can actually bring them in somewhere warmer, and this will speed up the germination, and it will help you start seedlings a bit earlier than you might otherwise be able to. So I know not everyone's got a lovely cozy little slow combustion wood stove like we do, but here's an example of how we get our tomatoes started. And I'm actually going to be putting tomato seeds in mid-July, so probably only 4 weeks from now. And I know that if I start them in mid-July, as long as I've got them inside at night, keeping nice and warm, They'll be outside and growing during the day, and we'll actually have them ready to put in the beds probably about a month earlier than conventional planting wisdom, which is actually a month of extra tomatoes for us as well. So yeah, that's what our winter wood stove looks like. And you might have another warm place near some kind of heater indoors, or you might have the top of a gas hot water service, or you might have some other sunny microclimate where you can bring them at night just to give them a little boost. Steve, you've asked about frost, and we don't get a lot of frost in Metro Melbourne. For some seeds, they will tolerate it, and for others, as soon as they get a frost when they're young, they'll all die. So it is better to have seed raising out of a frosty area, and that would be a good reason to have a greenhouse. And many people who are doing lots of plant propagation in frosty areas will have that for that reason. Top of the fridge, says Jan, also works well as a warm spot. The next tip, another kind of surprising and subtle one, is that your seedlings really need to be somewhere that you'll notice them regularly. So I park that barbecue on the main walkway in and out of the house, so I can't help but notice them. And just for a bit of an example, I totally didn't do this on purpose, but I've got two side-by-side examples of kale and broccoli seedlings. And this one that you can see here was the one that was on that barbecue in the right position. And this was the one that I ran out of space on the barbecue and put further down the end of the garden on the ground. And you can see it got absolutely smashed by, well, actually everything. Cabbage white butterflies, slugs and snails. They dried out even though I had a tray under them. It's just a complete disaster. So seedlings do really require daily attention. And you can give them that much more easily if you stick them in your face so that you can't help but see them and notice them and manage them. Nalini, I do have some notes coming, and that will tell you when I start seeds in Melbourne for different types of seeds. And I've got another resource to share with you on that as well. So then your seedlings start growing, and the first thing that you'll notice is whether or not the seed is very strong. So I have two examples for you here, side by side, of different basil seed and then a different beetroot seed. And you'll see some of that seed was just a lot better than others. So if you feel like you've executed all of these other steps perfectly, it's not you, it was the seed, or maybe you did something to the seed that stopped it from germinating. But I've been a little bit disappointed, to be honest, with what comes out of a commercial seed raising packet at times. And certainly just doing side-by-side trials will teach you a lot about what seed is quality and what isn't. If you have a situation like the beetroot that's on the right here, where we've got all of it germinating and we've got more than one plant in each hole, what I will actually do is, once I'm sure that they're up and away, I will go and thin those out to only one strong plant per hole. And what that means is I'll probably get in there with my fingernails and just pinch out the weaker seedling in each of those holes, because again, they are going to start competing with each other and therefore weakening each other if they both remain. So I guess you don't have to do that, but I try to do that and notice that I do get slightly better results. Now that I've said that, you'll probably notice with almost every commercial seedling you buy, it has multiple plants in each hole. So it's just a personal preference thing that you can choose to do. Right, now when do we plant them out? And no one told me this, but my rule of thumb is that once the seedling is roughly the same height as the punnet or the pot it's in, that's the time where I more or less tend to put it out. And it can go out a little bit earlier, a little bit later, in fact, quite a lot later in the case of these tomatoes. But if you're looking for a bit of a gauge, that's my rough rule of thumb. Generally, that's about 6 to 8 weeks. And as Jan says, you can also transplant them into larger pots or kind of move them through a series of pots before they go out into the garden. And yeah, that's what I do. And just a quick tip for tomatoes. This is only for tomatoes, by the way, but when you're planting tomatoes, you can bury them quite deeply in the ground, because the hairs along that tomato stem will actually become roots if they're in contact with soil. And that's something that we're going to look at with propagation in a few minutes. So just for tomatoes, you can bury them quite deeply. For most other plants, you need to make sure that they're planted at the same level that they were in the pot. Okay, bit of troubleshooting for seed raising, and think of this as a bit of a revision quiz as well. What is the issue with these carrot seedlings from a nursery? They look pretty good to me. Pop in the chat window what you think is going to be the issue here. I wish I had some pre-prepared thinking music for you, but I don't. Fran says too many. Yep, that's true. There's a lot of carrots in there. They are too close together and they are not thinned. And Claire and Jan have hit on the main one, which is that they're going to have stunted roots because they should have been put directly in the ground. Yeah, so that's the main one here. And the lesson here is that unfortunately, you are going to be offered things for sale, which should not be offered for sale. And good nurseries either won't stock them, which I actually haven't even seen yet, or at least they'll have a sign saying carrots are better grown from seed directly in the ground. I should say there's always a couple of exceptions to this, and I do know some market gardeners that do transplant carrots, but they do so at a much larger size when those roots are more robust and they can make sure that they go straight up and down when they get replanted. So just be aware that you need to make sure that you're following the right advice and not just taking for granted what you see on a shelf. Okay, next challenge. Get ready, folks. What is happening with these little seeds? Possibly a few things, actually. And while I'm waiting for your answers, Lorraine says she's been growing carrot tops on a windowsill from the roots, and she's got greens. And can these be planted out to grow edible roots? Probably not, Lorraine, unfortunately. They will grow some roots, but they're not going to look like the nice straight taproot that you might be hoping for. Carrots are biennial, so they tend to grow their nice roots one year, and then they'll store all that energy in the taproot, and then they'll come back and set seed the next year. So you're on like a 2-year cycle. What you will get is lots of lovely carrot greens, which of course are edible, but you probably won't get a nice tender taproot in that second year. Okay, so the results are in, and people are saying they're leaning towards the sunlight. There's not enough light. There's sun only on one side. They're leggy, not enough light. So yeah, absolutely, you're all right. And this is what seedlings will look like when they don't have nice, bright, even light. And that term leggy, hopefully you can see where that comes from. They just get these really thin, narrow stems, and that stem just gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And it gets to a point where the seedling actually will never recover from that. So this is something you want to correct as soon as you start to see it. Get those seedlings out into more bright, even light. They can actually do this if they're right next to a wall as like a natural response, knowing that there's a solid barrier behind them. But most of the time, this is a light issue that needs to be corrected. Okay, final one. What do you think is going on here? This is slightly trickier, this one, if you haven't got previous experience. Oh yeah, Fran's in there quickly, and Amy. Nitrogen deficient, and I think we did cover this in a previous session that I ran with the councils as part of this series. So a nitrogen deficiency is one of the things that shows up quick in seedlings where that seed raising mix wasn't very nutritious. And the symptoms of nitrogen deficiency are yellowing of the oldest leaves first, and then eventually a stunting. And some of you have put too much water. And what's interesting about that is that it can actually be created by too much water, because nitrogen is water soluble. So if you're constantly putting lots of water on the seedlings and it's all running out of the pot, you're actually leaching away that nitrogen that those seedlings will need. So the way that we fix that, well, if it's at this stage, we could just plant it out into our prepared bed and hopefully it would get the nutrients that it needed. We could also sprinkle a little bit of very nutrient-rich fertiliser onto these punnets on the surface, and they would be able to access it that way. That could be something like blood and bone or a pelletized organic fertiliser. There's some other suggestions that we talked about in the soil session. Or the way that I prefer to deal with this is by adding that compost and the worm castings as part of that seed raising mix. So I almost never see this issue unless I've just left the seedlings in there for so long that they've used all of that nutrient that was in that original mix. There's a couple of suggestions in the chat around sea salt and about worm juice, and they might help a little bit, but those very diluted liquid fertilizers they're not really fertilizers. They're more like boosts of micronutrients and microorganisms. So they may not help as much as you think, and I'd prefer to be adding something like that pelletized fertilizer, or actually Joanna has just said you could put the worm castings on top, and that will help. It's just a little bit more slow release, so you might not see results quite so quickly. Okay, so it looks like you all passed that little troubleshooting test, and they're really the most common things that can go wrong. So I hope that that's given you a sense for how to correct some things that might have happened or how to avoid those happening in the future. Now, I want to do a little quick note on carrots here, because I do get asked a lot about carrot seedlings. This is another one where people have quite common failures, and this is a technique that is adaptable for some other seeds as well. Now, as we've already spoken about quite a bit, carrots are one of the classics where you do want to make sure that you sow them directly where they are to grow. But carrot seeds can be very tricky because they are so fine that they dry out, and carrots need really consistent temperature and moisture while they're germinating. So the question is, how do we manage that when they're out there in the wild west of your garden bed? And the answer, or one of the answers I should say, is putting a blanket over the top of them. So on the left-hand side here, you can just see I've got this old woolen blanket. This is a lovely way to use an old woolen blanket that you can't darn anymore, or it's really full of holes. And so I have a garden blanket that gets used once a year for my carrots, and then dried and carefully folded away for the next year. And what I've done is similar to the coriander seed that I sowed earlier on that video. I've done a little drill, and then I've sprinkled my carrot seed in reasonably thickly, because there are quite a few failures with carrot seed. Then I've firmed that soil down with my hand, and I've covered them over with 1 or 2 layers of the blanket. The beauty of the blanket is that it's insulating, so it's helping to even out the temperature, and you can also water through it so you don't mess the seedlings up and wash them all through the bed. And it's also, of course, a mulch, so it's helping to keep that moisture in where the seeds need it. And so what you'll do is you'll leave that blanket on for a couple of days, and depending on how warm it is, you might wait 4 or 5 days, or you might have to wait a bit longer. As soon as you see the carrots poking up, and this is a picture of the carrot seeds poking up, as soon as you see them appearing in that row, you need to take that blanket off, preferably at night, so that they don't have to deal with immediate blazing sunshine. So give them an evening to adjust, then they should be fine after that. And I do find that once carrots are up and away, they're fairly easy, but just getting them through that initial germination stage is the really tricky part. After this, by the way, I will let them grow, and probably, when they get to about 5 centimetres high, I'll thin them out to about 1 inch or 2 or 3 centimetres apart. And then I do a second thinning where they get to about 5 centimetres apart. And usually you can eat those thinnings as little tender salad greens or baby carrots. So there you go. I don't know if you were interested in carrots or not, but that's the technique that I use for them. And if you're ever having trouble getting seeds germinated out there in the garden, say for coriander or anything else, then you can try this blanket technique, and hopefully you'll have more success. What the blanket technique won't help you with, of course, is pests. And I don't have a special slide for this, but just know that you need to try and control pests, preferably before you put the seed or seedlings out there, because they're, of course, so vulnerable when they're really tiny. And happily, we actually have a whole session on pest management coming up next weekend. So I'm not going to talk a lot about those today, and we'll come back in a week for that. Okay, so just finally on the seeds, I know this is going to be a common question for you out there. When do we put them in? And over time, you just will learn the right temperatures and when you can get things started, and it will become very intuitive. I don't use anything like a thermometer on the right anymore. I just kind of get a feel for when I'm going to get away with it, and you'll get a feel for your local conditions and frosts and so on. What you can do though, if you want a guide while you're getting started, is have a look at the ABC's Veggie Guide, which has all the different regions in Australia, and you click on them and then it will tell you in every month what you can plant and some planting advice. And also if you're looking for things like spacing and how far apart do we plant them, that's what you look for on the seed packets, or you ask the gardener that you got the seeds from. So there you go, little tip on sow what when. And I'm going to pause now for a couple of minutes of questions, and then we're going to have a quick break and come back and talk about the other methods of propagation. So Beck, you've been hopefully keeping tabs on that chat. Is there anything that we need to catch up at this stage?
Yeah, maybe a couple of things. Firstly, quick one, what kind of blanket? Does it have to be wool?
I guess it doesn't have to be wool, but I would certainly make sure that it's fully natural materials, because if you had, say, a polyester blanket or anything like that, of course, when it does eventually start breaking down, it's going to break down into millions of pieces of microplastic, which of course is not something you want to be adding to your food garden. So I guess it could be something that's pure cotton, for example, if you've got that. Pure wool is probably a bit of a better insulator, which is why I've gone for it. There are lots of those blankets in op shops in Australia, by the way, and many of them have got holes that nobody wants to darn. So you could definitely go looking there, and I certainly wouldn't buy anything new. And a couple of people have just said Hessian bags. You can absolutely try Hessian bags as well. That's a really good use for them.
Pamela had one a little bit earlier, talking about coriander or even parsley seeds. Is it better to let them self-seed or collect them and plant deliberately?
Oh, you could do either, absolutely. If you have plants that are going to seed, often they're just going to start coming up of their own accord, and that's of course wonderful, and there'll just be enough seed that's dropped out there that even if the conditions aren't perfect, a few of them will survive. So seed just dropping and coming up again is fantastic if that's where you want it, or if you're prepared to gently transplant it. It's sometimes nice to collect them just in case that doesn't happen when you're expecting it to, and sowing it yourself gives you a bit more of a guaranteed result. But yeah, one is not necessarily better than the other.
Joanna asked about spacing seeds, which we may have talked about. How do you know how close to put them to
in the punnets, I go, as I said, probably about 6 or 8 to one of those shallow punnets. And for the larger seeds that I'm putting in the larger punnets, I do about 3 or 4 and then thin them out to one strong plant, which is what you can hopefully see in this picture. I've got 1 zucchini, I've got 1 silver beet, 1 cucumber, for example, in those larger pots. If you're talking about how far apart to plant them once they're actually in the ground, you learn that pretty fast, but initially go looking on the back of seed packets, or just look them up on seed companies on the internet and they'll tell you. That is really quite important. If you put them too close together, you're going to get bonsai plants. So unless you're looking for gourmet miniature vegetables, pay quite close attention to those spacing suggestions, at least when you're getting started. And over time, you can gradually learn which things can be interplanted, which won't be competing with each other, which things you can push that slightly.
Vicky asked about your mod barbecue. Have you ever done any instructions on how you did it?
Oh, no. Look, if you can use an angle grinder, that's really all there is to it. But they're not the most friendly power tools to use. So if you're not confident using one, then I'd ask someone who is. Or you could just take the whole hood off and construct something with wire and so on. We did do that originally. Yeah.
A few more about specific plants, but maybe maybe it's best that we just move on and get to them at the end if we have time.
Okay, brilliant. I think what I'll do now is just give everyone a chance to get up and stretch their legs, and maybe take a 5-minute break and come back at 11:20. During that time, I'm going to stay here, and if there's any other questions that you want to catch up on in this point, we can answer them. Anyone who wants to refill their cups of tea or get another blanket to put on their lap, we'll start again officially at 11:20.
Cool. And thanks for sharing that link, Andrina. I'll also share that in my follow-up email, which will have the recording, Kat's notes, and details of how to register for next week's session on pests.
Cool. Thanks, Beck. So I don't want to answer any questions for people who have just walked away from their computer, but if you have a question that hasn't already been covered that you'd like to ask me now during the break, feel free to pop that in the chat, or you could turn on your microphone and ask it now.
Hi Kat, it's Julie. I'd like to ask about some baby tomatoes that have self-sown, and I've got them sitting on my kitchen windowsill. They're tiny, but I'm hoping to get them through winter and into planting for this year. I've never tried it before, so any tips on that?
Yeah, I think it can work, Julie, and I've certainly got friends in Hepburn, Ashley, so cooler area, and they have a little greenhouse and they get tomatoes going all through the winter into spring in there. So certainly possible, as long as they don't get any really strong cold. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So is the windowsill okay, or should I bring them a bit away from the cooler night air?
Oh, look, yeah, you could. It's hard to know exactly, what the microclimate's like. Yeah, that you'll know. Look, if they're staying green and looking happy, they can stay where they are. If they start to look a bit sad, then warm them up a little bit. They still need light though, so I'd keep them near that windowsill.
Yeah, no, they seem to be doing okay, and I have the heater on at 16 overnight anyway, so the place always stays a little bit warmer. So yeah, we'll see how they go. It's my first experiment. So
awesome. Yeah, good luck with it.
Thank you.
I've certainly got plans to do the same here, and try and get a few through the winter and up. Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you.
Hi, it's Anne-Marie here. I'm
G'day.
loving the session. If I need to get a copy of the previous sessions, I've already booked in for next week. How do I go about getting a copy a previous copy, the 2 sessions?
Beck?
Yeah, I will send them all out in my follow-up email. So you'll be able to watch back and catch up on those sessions.
Thank you so much. Greatly appreciated.
Brilliant.
Hello. Hi, Kat. Oh, sorry. Just a quick one. I've got a thriving rhubarb plant out the back, and it's shooting up heaps and heaps of seeds. Are seeds the best way to propagate and share with friends and neighbours, or other ways?
For rhubarb, did you say, Michelle?
Yep.
Yeah, you can definitely propagate rhubarb from seed. It's a pretty slow process. But, so you'll be waiting a bit longer, but if you want lots and lots of plants, that's the way to go. Rhubarb, usually you'd propagate it by division, which we're just about to cover. So if you want almost instant results, stay tuned for that.
Will do. Thank you.
Hi, Libby. That's a hand up? G'day.
Hi. Kat, I'm really enjoying this. I'm sorry I've had to break and drive in the middle of it, but it's lovely. Can you please help me? You may have done this while I was driving, but I'm interested in the seed saving and how to know when a seed is mature enough to harvest for saving.
Oh, yeah. Yes, really good question. Not a clean, simple answer, because it depends what plant group we're talking about, Libby. And I'd love to do a whole session on seed saving for you. But yeah, I guess, there's a few different rules of thumb depending on what plant family we're talking about. Okay, if it's something like a tomato, you want that tomato to be a bit overripe, probably past the point where you'd want to put it in a salad, and that will make sure that seed has got all of the nourishment from that parent plant that it's ever going to get. And for a pumpkin, for example, you'd harvest the pumpkin when the mother plant is dying off and going yellow, and those seeds actually get stronger for about 20 days after you've picked the pumpkin, interestingly enough. For lots of other plants like lettuces or parsley, or those brassica, the rocket seeds, you'll hopefully see the seed heads appearing. And when they start to get a little bit yellow, when a few seeds start to drop, when you can rub the seed heads in your fingers and feel that they're quite hard, those are the times when I'd start to harvest them. And usually I'll hang them up in a bunch and let them fully dry out before I then start the saving process.
Thank you. That's useful. Thank you very much.
Bit of a whirlwind answer. Hopefully we get a chance to do a proper seed saving session at some point.
That'd be lovely. Yeah.
Great. Okay, it's 11:21, Beck. What do you reckon?
Yeah, let's get back to it.
Okay, time to go again. Hope if you're not in view of your computer, you're at least in earshot. So what we will do next is go back in and we're going to start talking about other ways of propagating plants. And no, we're not, because Zane's cooperating with me. Goodness me. Sorry, folks. Appears to have just shut down my PowerPoint. No, there we go. Anyone else got a grumpy computer this morning? Mine's certainly not behaving as usual. Right, back on track. So having talked about seeds, we're now going to move into some alternative techniques for propagating. And one of the questions that immediately comes up is, why would you do these methods as opposed to raising seeds? And of course, there are pros and cons of both options. With seed saving, most seeds have gone through a process of pollination that involves an exchange of genetics. So it's like a sexual reproduction for plants, and they end up with something which might not be like the parents, much like us as children are not like our parents in some ways. So seeds, sometimes you'll get different results, and that can be a great thing because we get new plant varieties. We can control that, which is not something that we're able to cover today. We can control that pollination process so that we get consistent results. But another way that we can have very consistent results from one generation to the next generation of plants is by propagating vegetatively. And what that means is that we're actually growing the new plant from a piece of the parent plant. So the genetics will be absolutely identical, and we know that the plant that grows is going to have all the same characteristics as the parent plant it was taken from. Another reason why we might want to propagate vegetatively is that it can be a bit faster and a bit more reliable than seed propagation. During the break, Michelle was asking me about propagating rhubarb, for example, which does produce seeds, and you can produce hundreds and hundreds of rhubarb plants from one harvest of seeds. But most people will propagate rhubarb by division, and rather than waiting maybe 2 or 3 years before you've got a really large, thriving, harvestable rhubarb plant, with division you might be waiting only a few months before you've got that going. So you can really shortcut a lot of growth and also make sure those characteristics are the same. Now, for division, this is a fairly straightforward technique, which is fantastic for beginners. And we can use this technique whenever we notice that the plants are growing in a bit of a clump and we're starting to see lots of little growth centres. I call them growth centres. They probably have another much more technical name. But I'd like you to look at this picture and just notice how with this sorrel plant, we can see quite a few little places where new leaves are starting to emerge. If you are able to see my mouse, I'm just circling some of them. So we've got new growth popping up from lots of different little centres. And this plant is spreading slowly outwards in a clumping style. So that tells me that I can do division with this plant. You don't even need to know the name of plants. If you can recognise that technique, you know that you can divide them. Okay, so how do we do that division? I'm going to jump into a video for you. And again, it's quite complicated for me to share videos with you today, unfortunately, because the computer's not allowing me to have them simultaneously open. But here we go. So I've got a video for you dividing my sorrel plant.
That's much bigger than I thought it would be. Thought it was tiny from the photo.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what you saw there, I'll just go back through it again. I'm filming this with my arms around a camera, which is why you get a nice close-up of my wrist, unfortunately. What I'm doing here is literally just pulling this clump apart. And as I start to pull it, I can feel that it does want to separate and come away. There are also a couple of shared larger roots that I'm going to need to break. And in this case, they were strong enough for me to just rip them apart with my hands. But if they weren't, you could just grab your secateurs and you could slice through them. Sometimes I've even done this with a sharp spade and just put the whole clump on the ground and just use my foot to drive the spade through it and cut it into sections. And that's okay too for most plants. If you end up with roots that are quite damaged, we do usually recommend just slicing them cleanly, because cleaner wounds are easier for that plant to heal over. And with any large wound like that, there is a small risk that it might get some kind of rot appearing in it before it can heal over. But really, that's pretty much all there is to it. And just the last step at the end, what you saw me doing here, is just trimming off some of those leaves, because we do want to make sure that those roots can take up enough nutrient and enough moisture to sustain the canopy of leaves above it. And by trimming them back to just a few little shoots, we reduce that stress that those roots are going to be under in trying to support those above ground parts. And so you can just see me there trimming them off, and then we're done. And I think if I go back into the slides, you can actually see how many plants I got from that one sorrel plant. There you go. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 plants, just like that, as quickly as that, from one clump. So really straightforward. Now, Nalini has asked for some examples of clumping plants. So rhubarb is another one that I do a lot of at home, and I'm wondering if people want to put a little list up and I can just filter it. Renee, absolutely having a hair tie on your wrist is a must. I'm sorry about that rather awkward close-up. But yeah, this is a technique whenever you notice that clumping characteristic. While you're popping those in the chat, I think there's another video that I wanted to share with you that shows a different plant. So I'm going to pull that up and we'll have a look at it. Okay, here's another one for you. And this time we're going over to our oregano plant. Well, I'm just going to pause it there. And all I've done is just pull back the edges of that clump a little bit. And hopefully you can see in there, we've actually got roots that are already forming. So this plant spreads out in a clump and it actually does its own layering, which we haven't come to yet. But anywhere that we see these spreading stems starting to put down roots, we can actually just snip that little section off and replant that, and that's a brand new oregano plant. So again, a nice straightforward example of how we can use division for a clumping plant. Okay, anything coming through on that chat, Beck, for examples? Thyme, yep.
Thyme, mint.
And mint, absolutely. Yeah, really, really common examples in the garden. Oh, and Jan said a lot of the alliums, which is the onion family. And that's true. Lots of the things like chives and garlic chives as well are very easily divided using this method. And I also see Vicky asking, how many times can each plant be regrown like that? Pretty much indefinitely, Vicky, as far as I can tell. And yeah, it's an amazing thing. You're almost starting the plant again from scratch. So these plants have been passed down from generations of gardeners just using these really simple methods. They don't necessarily have an expiry date when we're doing this kind of method. Okay, let's move on from division now. Now I want to talk about cuttings. This is slightly more complicated, but not by much. With cuttings, we're taking a piece of the mother plant, usually a piece of branch or stem, and we're cutting it carefully, which I'll talk about next, and then just sticking it in some potting mix or even just directly in the soil and allowing that to take root and start growing. And this is the way that most of your perennial shrubs and fruit trees and things are grown as well, often combined with a technique called grafting, which is a bit more than we're able to cover today, but sometimes not as well. So if you want to start growing lots of your own fruit trees, then cuttings are one of the techniques that you will need. Michelle, you've just put bay with a question mark, and bay trees are something you can definitely grow very easily from cuttings using this method. And blueberries as well, for Mary, who's just popped that in. So what you can see here on the left-hand side is a mulberry tree that is outside at my place at the moment. And that was grown from a cutting of the most delicious mulberry that I have in the local area, and a mulberry which is cropping in springtime around late October, early November, which is an especially helpful time of year to have fruit when not many other things are available. So I'm particularly keen that I have that mulberry growing in my garden. And for that reason, rather than going out and buying a mulberry tree at random from a nursery, I'm going to take a particular special cutting from that tree and make sure that it's exactly that tree that I have growing at my place. Now, I put that cutting in that pot, wait for it, about 2 years ago. So one of the disadvantages of cuttings, unfortunately, is that you have to be extremely patient for this method. And we're not even probably up to the stage yet of where you would buy a mulberry tree at a nursery. Maybe next year is the point that they would sell it. So you save about 3 years if you go and buy a commercial tree, but you don't necessarily get to choose what type of mulberry you get at your place. So there's a bit of a toss up there, cheap and a long time, or shortcutting that process and costing you a fair bit of money and getting started quickly. On the right hand side is a Luma apiculata, which is a kind of myrtle and produces very, very delicious berries, similar to a Chilean guava for people who know that plant. This is a lovely edible hedge. And when you're getting a sense for what can I take a cutting for, yeah, it's these sorts of fruit trees and shrubs which do really, really well. Now, when you take a cutting, you're taking a piece of branch and you're putting it in some soil, and you're basically starting a race between that twig being able to form roots and that twig starting to rot. So the things that I'm going to say now are all about giving the twig the best chances of forming roots rather than just rotting in the ground. You are going to have some of them rot though. So I'm not going to give you all of the very complex methods that they use in commercial propagation to avoid that. I'm just going to say take more cuttings and maybe try a couple of different arrangements until you get the result you need. Because presumably on a home garden scale, you don't need 40 mulberries, but you could take quite a few cuttings and hopefully you'll get 5 mulberries that work, and then you'll still have surplus to share. Also know with cuttings that we take cuttings from different parts of the plant at different times of year. I tend to do a lot of my cuttings in winter because that's when I tend to have time to think about these things. And so I take hardwood cuttings where the branches sort of change colour and become a bit more woody. If you want to start doing softwood cuttings in spring, they're really the tips of the branches that are soft and flexible. And you can do semi-ripe cuttings at other times of year as well. This is one of those examples where you would look at what plant you want to take cuttings from, and you do a 10-second search on the internet and go, what type of cuttings are most successful? And it will say, for this plant, try hardwood cuttings. And that's all I do. So I don't have the answers to what type of wood for every plant that's out there. But if you know roughly what those types are, then you can just go and look them up and find the results that you need. All right, so let's just go through cuttings and a few different methods of taking them, And then I'm going to catch up on some of those questions that I can see popping up in the chat window, and hopefully some of them will get covered. Firstly, to take good cuttings, we need to know just a tiny little bit about the plant stems and how they turn into plants. So I've got for you here a couple of pieces of my grapevine, and I'm going to point out for you the nodes of them. And hopefully you can see my mouse. What I'm doing now is just circling around the buds, which you can hopefully see on those pieces of grape. Those buds are what would have turned into leaves if that had stayed on my grapevine. But those buds also have the potential, amazingly, to put out roots if they are in the right conditions, i.e. underground. So these are what we call the nodes on any plant. And the sections in between, you don't really need to know this, but these are called the internodes. And the point here is that the nodes are where the growth happens in the plant. So what we want to do when we're taking cuttings is not leave sections of internode on either end of the cutting, especially not in the ground, because growth can't happen in the internode section. It's not going to put out roots from there. So what will happen is that will slowly rot away until it gets up to a node, and then it could start spreading that rot through the rest of the plant. So for the plant's best chance of healing over the cuts that we've made, we want to make sure, as I've done in these cuttings, that we cut just below the node for the bit that's going in the ground, and ideally just above the node for the bit that's poking out of the surface. And that's, yeah, still important, but maybe not quite as essential. The other important trick for cutting, any cutting really, is we want to have probably about 4 nodes on each section. And of course, you might get that in a smaller length for some plants where you've got these nodes very close together, or you might need to spread them out a bit if the nodes are spaced well apart. And the reason I say about 4 nodes is that means you can bury the cutting halfway, and you'll have about 2 nodes below the ground and about 2 nodes above the ground. And that will give you 2 chances for roots to form and 2 chances for the leaves to form. So you could have more, but I've found personally it's helpful to have about that many. Our final, most important tip here is noting which way is up. And it deserves a smiley face because I know it seems really simple, but when you start taking cuttings and you're not as familiar with plants, actually this can be the hardest thing. You don't want to make the cutting upside down in the pot, because then it will get confused and it might not work as well. So take a note of whether the plant or which part of that branch is pointing up. Make sure that you put it in the right way in the potting mix. And when you're doing that and taking lots of cuttings, every gardener will work out their own conventions. For me, I cut the base of them on a flat angle, as I'm trying to highlight for you now with my mouse. And at the top, I cut it on an angle. It's sort of a little finesse here, but if we did get rain on the top of that cut, the water would hopefully run off rather than sitting on it. And that helps it to shed that water and hopefully avoid any kind of fungal infection that would come from it being wet over a prolonged period. And yeah, so that's the main thing about getting them in the right way up. Now, Nadine's put a question in there around these cuttings looking quite dry, and would they work? And so the point is, you don't take these cuttings and then wait a week and then put them in moist potting mix. You do this all as quickly as possible. And so we don't leave them lying around. Grapes, though, when they get to the stage where we do take cuttings, which is around this time of year, they always look a bit dry like this. So you'll just have to trust me that if I cut that stem open, it is actually nice and green and moist inside. But definitely on the outside, it looks like it's dead already. But don't hang around with the cuttings, get them out there as quickly as you can. Yeah, so another thing you can do, and there's lots and lots of little tricks that you can use at this stage to improve your results. One of the things you could do is make sure you've got a sterile potting mix that you're putting them into. Another thing is cleaning your secateurs with methylated spirits so that there's nothing on them like a little fungal spore. There is rooting hormone out there, which there are some mixed safety reviews of, and certainly not something I'm personally interested in using, and I've never really felt the need to use with my results, which are quite good most of the time. If you want a more natural alternative, people sometimes dip the ends of their cuttings in honey, which is a natural way of promoting rooting and growth. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit now, just keeping my eye on the clock for you. The next step is we'll pop them in that potting mix and put a label in and keep them moist and be very patient. So there you can see my 4 grape cuttings happily settled in that pot. What will happen next is at the end of winter, we'll start to see those buds opening up and forming leaves. Amazingly, there actually won't be roots at this stage, which is just incredible, right? But the roots actually, in this case, come often after the leaves. So if you pulled them out in spring, you'd be surprised. And what will happen is the roots will slowly build and catch up. And at the end of one summer, 1 cycle's worth of growth, we'll have something that is ready to be separated from the pot and planted out, either in a larger pot or in its final position. So it does take time, but you can propagate many, many plants quite easily and quickly using these methods. As I said, do lots of experiments, and that's how you learn. You could try different sized cuttings. You could try different types of wood at different times of year. You could try putting them inside a plastic bag to increase the humidity. You could try putting them on top of your gas hot water service so they have a little bit of bottom heat. All of those things for some plants will increase your chances of success. But usually I'll just try this method and I might not have 100% success, but often I have 50%. So if I've taken a lot of cuttings, I still get some good results. Yeah, and Fran, that's right. They don't need nutrients until they start forming roots. So really the mix in this case is about just a nice balance of moisture and also oxygen so that we don't have any rot taking place. All right. Okay, so just another quick example of cuttings. In this case, unlike the grape, which is deciduous and doesn't have leaves at the moment when I'm taking the cuttings, lots of plants are perennial and evergreen, so they're going to have leaves when you take the cuttings. And this is just to show you one way of dealing with them. Leaves are drawing moisture away from that stem. And of course, when there's no roots to replace them, that can be quite serious. But leaves are also a way of the plant feeding itself and stimulating itself to grow. So what I've done here, as you can see, is I've stripped off a large amount of the leaves and just left a few tiny little shoots to encourage that plant to keep growing. They're also quite long cuttings with quite a few nodes here, probably about 8. So for something like a rosemary, you might even halve these cuttings and still get away with it. Another way to take cuttings, and actually a much easier method, is to root them in water. And this method works for lots of fleshy and soft stemmed plants. So I've got some examples there like tomato, pepino, which is a perennial melon that's related to tomatoes. For the person who mentioned they were trying to grow sweet potatoes before we started today, this is a very, very easy way to propagate sweet potatoes. And lots of your house plants, including the one in the photograph that's on my desk, you can see here, will also be very easily propagated using this method. So all I'm doing here is taking those cuttings. I can be quite sloppy about it because they're going to have this constant source of moisture. And we just pop the cuttings in there and let them sit for about 3 to 4 weeks until we start to see roots appearing, like you can see in the close-up photograph. At that stage, once there are roots appearing, then we can take them out of the water and plant them in potting mix, and away we go. So yeah, that's a really, really nice technique. And I would always prefer to use this method if it's a plant that will work with this method because it is just much more successful and much higher success results. Okay, moving on now, it's a couple of other ways that we can propagate plants. And for things like strawberries, we have these amazing things called runners, or stolons, the technical term. And these are long horizontal stems that run across the ground and start to form little baby plants at nodes that appear on them. And here's one that's quite well developed. and hopefully you can see that pink stem that's come from the strawberry plant next to it. So we can, with these runners, simply snip that umbilical cord and start planting these out as separate plants. So that is nature going, I really want you to propagate. It doesn't get much easier than that. You just dig up the new plant and away you go. There are other expressions of that in the plant world, and one of them is a thing called a sucker. A sucker is a small plant that forms around the base of some plants. This is a not particularly elegant photograph of one of my bananas, and you can see there's a couple of little suckers, or what we very cutely call banana pups, emerging from the base. So we could get in there with a spade and just gently dig them up. And sometimes there's a bit of an attachment to the roots, so we need to cut through that. And for something like a banana that's fleshy, I have a special old serrated bread knife that I will just gently insert in between them and saw away until I've separated it out. And so that's a pretty easy way to get new banana plants. And this technique will also work if you see these popping up around figs or olives. Raspberries are particularly prone to it in a sometimes weedy way. Bananas. So just be on the lookout for little suckers emerging from the base of plants. If you are trying to do this with fruit trees, just be aware that, and this is a slightly longer topic than we have a chance to go into today, but many fruit trees are propagated on a root stock, which is actually a slightly different variety to the top part of the plant that we pick the fruit from. So if we got suckers from a root stock, which is maybe say on an apple or something like that, we would not then actually be copying the plant that we've grown to love the fruit from. So just make sure that it's not a grafted plant that has two different varieties surgically combined together. And as Nadine said, passion fruit is a really good example. And the rootstock that's often used commercially for passion fruit suckers heavily and does not produce a fruit that you would like to put on a pavlova. Yeah, so in those cases, we actually want to cut those off and try and control the growth. Okay, so there you go, suckers. And the final technique I'm going to share with you today is probably one of my favourites, and that is called layering. And layering is a great technique because it is a bit like a sucker or a runner, surgically, or not surgically, it's still physically attached to the mother plant. So all those issues that we were talking about with drying out with cuttings that we take don't come into play here, because we're actually drawing all that moisture and also nutrient from the mother plant during the process of plant formation. It's brilliant because it's so simple, and it works for most plants that you can physically bend a branch down to the ground on, which is not all of them. But if you've got whippy, soft stems that you can bend to the ground, then do give this method a try. I'm going to show you a video, very simple video of me layering my currant bush. If I can get one final video up for you today. Let's hope so. Okay, it's a really simple, really short one. Have a look at the center of the screen and the buds on that currant branch. And that's it. I said it was really short, didn't I? All I've done, as you've seen, is I've got a stem that's naturally a bit low to the ground. I've bent it down to the ground. I've located a node, those buds where the roots or the shoots could form, and I've pinned it to the ground, in this case using the nearest rock, but you could also use a brick. You could also peg it down to the ground if you've got a garden tent peg or some kind of garden peg, anything that will maintain that close contact with moist soil for a few months. And so what will happen here, of course, is that those nodes are going to get that trigger that it's underground, and it's going to start to put roots out, and roots are going to form from that node, and in say a year or so, or whenever those roots have formed successfully, I can take that rock off, I can snip the stem connecting that piece to the parent plant, I can gently lift out the roots, and I can repot that, this time in an upright position. So I've got a nice vertical stem, and I've got my new currant bush. So just one more time, we'll just have a look at that really short video. And there you go. So I'm all about really simple, really lazy techniques, and it probably doesn't get any lazier than that at the end of the day. So I hope that excites you. It's an easy one that you can go out and try today. And I've seen this a lot with currants. You can do that with mints. You could do it with feijoas or other kind of shrubby plants that have got stems that are near to the ground. Berries actually often do it themselves, as in raspberries or brambleberries. And the photograph on the right-hand side here is an example of a young berry, which is a bit like a boysenberry. And they send out these super vigorous long shoots every year. And if I don't get to them in time and they touch the surface of the ground, instead of starting to form the leaves, they start to form roots, as you can see here. And I don't know, we can't really zoom in, but this one was partly underground and a little bit on the surface still. And I've got a combination on this little rooting area of roots and a green bud ready to form into a leaf. So this berry is actually hedging its bets. Is it going to be above ground, below ground? It doesn't know, it doesn't care. It's just going to try and grow either way. And so I've snipped it off, as you can see up here. If you've got really good eyesight, you'll see all the buds are actually pointing to the ground, because that possibly was going to not be on the ground but up in the air. So it's a bit of a confused plant still, but as soon as I transplant that, next season it'll magically correct itself and all start turning into a plant the right way up again. So there you go. That's all the content that I wanted to share with you, and we've got just over 5 minutes left. So I'm going to check in with Beck around any questions that relate to what we've just spoken about, and then we can open it up and just clarify anything else that you need to feel confident to give this a go.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Kat. What I might do is just kind of wrap us up, because I've got a few messages, and then what we'll do is we'll get back into the questions at the end, because there are lots and I've got some good ones recorded. So yeah, I just want to firstly start by thanking Kat for this awesome webinar, another awesome webinar. Covered a lot of ground, but I think you've got such a good way of helping us not just learn new tips and tricks, but also just understand how everything's working, and therefore we can apply that knowledge to so many other things in the garden. So firstly, yeah, thanks so much, Kat. And yeah, hoping everyone's got a lot of good info and tips and knowledge to get going. And I think the message is it's all about trial and error. So get out there and get started. I do like to wrap up these webinars by making a request of everyone, and what it is just to reflect on the session and really pick out one key thing or one key commitment that you're going to make and that you're going to try. So perhaps it's trialing a new seed raising mix, or maybe you're going to move your seeds indoors and cozy up with them at night, or maybe you're going to do a few different experiments, rooting plants in water versus soil. So I'd like you to have a bit of a think about that, and just perhaps make a note, write it down in your phone or in a piece of paper, or share it with the person you're watching the webinar with. And if you do the follow-up survey that I'll send out, I'll ask you about that action that you'll take. So a reminder that this is the third of 4 webinars with Kat. Kat's final workshop with us is next Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. And that one's covering garden pests, which has been a very hot topic throughout the chat and lots of questions about it. So I'm sure lots of people will be tuning into that one. If you are interested in the session, but you aren't available to watch it live, just register for it and you'll get a recording of it and you'll be able to watch it back. On Sunday, we also have another webinar, this time on chooks, keeping happy, healthy backyard chooks with the wonderful Jessamine Miller. So if you're interested in starting up some chooks, or already have your chooks and you want some more information, come along to that one. And I will include details for both of those sessions in my follow-up email. Likewise, I'll also share a recording of this one and all of the webinars with Kat to date. Anyone in Stonington, or this also applies for lots of other councils, but Stonington residents can buy discounted compost products. like Worm Farm's compost bins or Bakashi bins, and they're at 40% off for Stonington residents. So that's through a website called Compost Revolution. So you can have a Google of that one and enter your address and see if you can get a discount. But I'll send some info in an email after this. Another one for Stonington residents, we are currently in the middle of our backyard biodiversity blitz, which is all about you telling us what's living in your garden or on your street or in your local park. And it's really helping to build a picture of biodiversity. It's all done through iNaturalist, which is a really cool app. It's a global platform and app, and you can talk to other people in the community and get help identifying plants or any living species. And I'll send some info in a follow-up email about that as well. And the very last one for Stonington residents, as I mentioned at the start, we are currently in the process of preparing a climate emergency action plan in response to the climate emergency that we are in. And we are looking for your contributions, your ideas on what you want to see council committing to over the next couple of years. So please get involved and share your ideas on what a sustainable city looks like. And likewise, we'll send an email link with that information. I think I've mentioned, but the survey, I will send out a survey, and if you do like these free events, so please let us know how we can improve them, and we can hopefully continue to run more webinars for you. So huge thanks to Kat, huge thanks to Andriana also, who's been helping quietly in the background with all of your questions. Obviously, thank you to every single one of you who joined. I think we've had 150. So wishing you luck for your garden and hoping we see you at an event soon. But on that note, we've got a few more minutes and I think we're happy to go a bit over time. So we'll jump back to Kat and some questions. Okay, here are my questions. So Michelle's asked, is it better to divide when the plant is not actively growing or outside of season?
Look, I just do it whenever I find the time for it. Probably technically the plant prefers to be divided when it's not actively growing because you're not disrupting that burst of growth. But I give it a go whenever, as long as it's not a precious special plant, just in case something does go wrong. Yeah. And
in terms of bunching plants, do all bunching plants work as a clump, like celery? Would that work?
Celery, no, it's not a bunching plant, celery. So no, you won't be able to do it with celery. Celery's got, it's a single plant rather than having lots of separate plants forming around it. If you have got a celery that's got other plants around it, it's likely that there were two seeds that grew together in that clump. So yeah, it's a good point. Watch out for that one. Make sure they are truly a clumping bunching plant. Somebody asked, I think, for some more examples, and violets are another one at my place that I do a lot of. Just trying to think. Obviously, as soon as you start trying to think of examples, they all vanish from your heads. But if you know some, you've got some in your head, feel free to pop them in the chat.
Mary's asked about blueberries. Are they the same as grapes, 2 above, 2 below?
Yeah, blueberries you do from cuttings. I actually haven't propagated them myself personally, so I would just go and look up blueberry propagation and just see what the internet says about the recommended methods. But in terms of cuttings, it would be the same, where you want to give yourself a few chances, so a couple of nodes above, a couple of nodes below.
Tram has asked how long the root needs to be before you can pot it. Is there a rule of thumb? I think that's actually in relation to water.
In relation to the water ones? Look, I don't know. It probably doesn't matter too much as long as they are starting to form roots, because of course they'll all start growing in the soil when you put them in there. I would put them out at this stage, so I'm just going to lift one out live on camera and see. Can you see that? That's about 5 centimetres long, little shoot. I'd be totally happy with that. So you don't need a very well-established root system. And of course, as soon as it starts growing, this plant is also looking for nutrients as well. So the water is not going to have a lot in there, and it's going to benefit from going out into some rich soil from that stage.
Just talking about growing in water, Cameron has issues with them going backwards or dying when potting them? Any advice there?
Probably if you're having them go backwards, you could just firstly check that it is a plant that can be successfully propagated in that way. I just check that by searching the internet and whatever the plant is, cuttings in water, and just checking that someone somewhere in the world has done it before. And also, if they're dying, then just try changing that water regularly every couple of days, because it can get a bit smelly and a bit funky. So you might have more success with fresh water changed every day or so.
Cool. Mary's asked about strawberry plants. Is it true that you should replace the original strawberry plant after a few years, or is that just a myth?
No, I think that's true. I'm not a big strawberry grower. I have to say, I find strawberries, of all the berries, the hardest work to grow. So I tend to bias my space towards brambleberries, which are a lot less fussy. And that's one of the things that makes strawberries fussy, is they do tend to become unproductive over time. So commercially, they replace them, I think, almost every year from those runners. And also they say virus-free runners, because strawberries are very prone to picking up viruses that also stop them from producing. So they're getting virus-free runners propagated by official nurseries where they're certified free of viruses. So it's all quite complicated with strawberries. But yeah, the simple answer is yes, that is a real thing. And you shouldn't expect a strawberry plant to just consistently produce without repropagating from those runners quite regularly.
Cool. I think we've lost a big chunk of people, so what we might do now is just move back to the chat box. So if you've got a question that we haven't answered yet, maybe just retype it into the chat box. Or turn your camera.
I got a private question come through from someone just about fruit trees and can any of them be propagated from seed, and specifically citrus. Mm-hmm. And I'll just say, like, I haven't personally done much fruit tree propagation from seed. There are reasons why we don't do a lot of that, and it comes back to that thing I was talking about with rootstock, where often fruit trees are grafted, which means we have that rootstock, which is one variety, and then we graft another variety on top that we want to pick the fruit from. And the rootstock is all about matching your soil conditions. So we have some rootstocks that are better in clay soil, or some that are better in alkaline soil, or some that are disease resistant for something that crops up in your area. And the rootstock also controls vigor, the eventual size of the tree. So whether it's a 10 to 20 metre wild apple tree, or whether it's a dwarf apple that will only get half a metre high, for example. So that's the reason why we graft a lot of fruit trees, to control different scenarios. And it doesn't mean to say you can't grow things from seed, but you might lose some of those advantages that you had with a grafted tree. The other thing about growing trees from cuttings as opposed to seeds is that sometimes you speed up the fruiting substantially. So instead of fruiting in maybe 3 years, we might have to wait 6 or 10 years to get some fruit. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't try it. It just means you have to be prepared for mixed results and waiting a long time. That said, there are a couple of fruit trees you definitely can grow well from seed. And the ones I'm most familiar with are the stone fruits, like nectarines and peaches and plums and apricots. And they have a good track record of growing similar to the parents and producing similar fruit. And they're not always grafted either. So you can eat a peach and then let that peach seed dry for a few weeks and then plant that and expect a pretty good peach tree to come up. You can definitely try them. Citrus, if you do want to grow citrus from seed, there is, I lost his name, Ian, I've got his book on the shelf about 2 meters away, so I might go get it. But there's an amazing legend, I think Ian Tolley is his name, who has written purely about citrus for maybe 30 or 40 years. And he's got a great book on propagating citrus using all kinds of different methods that you might like to look at. Citrus are sometimes grown from seed, but the seed can't dry out. It's one of the rare examples where it's actually grown from fresh seed that I believe spends a bit of time in a fridge to give it a cold cycle before it regrows, I think, something like that. So there's some specialised citrus techniques that you'll want to look up if you want to try them from seed.
Amy's asked about wormwood, that I think this is a burning question. She's lost some due to the sun over summer. but it has a lot of top and lower growth. Is it a leaning? Oh, it's leaning over a lot. Can she cut the top portion and try to grow from the cutting?
Absolutely. And I can see Jen said they're very easy to propagate, and I concur. Yeah, wormwood's one of those really hardy plants. And in fact, many common garden plants are common because they are easy to propagate. So things like geraniums, for example, and daisies, lots of super common garden plants, just have a crack. And you'll probably be pleasantly surprised by how simple they are to get going.
A couple of people have asked about indoor plants, but I think I might stick to the food-based edibles questions. The easiest way to grow spring onions?
Spring onions, usually we grow from seed, although there are some clumping onions out there. So you just try and find out if the variety that you've got is a clumping type. And if it's growing in a bunch, then we use that division technique that I showed you. Otherwise, we just grow them from seed using that simple seed raising technique I showed you before.
Michael's asked, are parsnips the same as carrots in terms of all the rules that we talked about?
Probably. There's not many vegetables that I dislike, but parsnips are one of them. So I'm afraid I've got zero personal experience growing them. But yeah, similar to a carrot, they do obviously have a long taproot, so you're not going to want to be moving them around very much. Parsnip, the only thing I do know about it is it needs very fresh seed. So that seed, I think, has to be less than a year old. Otherwise, your results start to go downhill very quickly. So if you haven't had success, try and get some super, super fresh seed and see what happens.
Cool. Banana in frosty areas.
There are some photographs of bananas growing with snow around them for at least part of the year. I don't know whether they've got fruit on them, but they're surprisingly hardier. They're hardier than I thought they were, let's put it that way. And yeah, so if you've got what we call a microclimate, and yes, if we've got an area that's slightly warmer than your surrounding area, maybe it's a north-facing brick or masonry wall that catches sun and then is able to distribute that back at night, for example, or certainly if you've got a greenhouse or a sheltered spot that doesn't get strong winds or something like that, you could pop in a banana and give it a go.
What about onion seeds in punnets or directly into the ground?
Onion seeds, look, technically you could probably do them into the ground directly, but then you've got all those things I was talking about before in terms of trying to control moisture and temperature and pests and so on. So my default for those smaller seeds is to do them in punnets, unless there's a really good reason not to, like carrots and coriander, where they just don't tolerate that transplanting very easily. The other benefit, which I'm not sure if I mentioned in the session, is that you can actually keep whatever's growing in your garden beds growing for maybe 6 to 8 weeks longer. So you're actually stacking in time and space these two crops simultaneously. And so you're not having to raise that bed and then wait much longer until you've got a crop coming out of the soil again.
Is it too late to plant onion now?
Oh, that's a good question, Alex. I'm not actually sure. I would look at the Gardening Australia veggie guide and see when they suggest for our region. Onions need quite a long time in the soil, and certainly if you wanted that space back to plant your spring crops, it's probably too late. But if you have lots and lots of space and you can just let them grow all the way through spring into early summer, maybe. So yeah, look up that planting guide on Gardening Australia and see when they recommend.
I've got it ready to send out in an email as well, so you can wait for that a little bit later today or tomorrow. There's a few questions still about indoor plants, peace lilies, fiddle leaf figs, and something else. Kat, do you have advice on? Do you know indoor plants, or would you?
I know some indoor plants. I've definitely done a lot with peace lilies before. I've got one a few meters away from me, and yeah, I do exactly the same as I did with the sorrel outside, and definitely trim back those leaves a little bit to help those roots recover. Fiddle leaf figs, I don't really know much about. They don't look like a clumping plant to me, so probably they'd be a cuttings plant, and what I'd be doing is typing that into a search engine and seeing what propagation methods the internet recommends, and then just using the general approach that we've talked about today and having a go. Oh, actually, one point on that. If you've got plants that have a milky sap, which includes figs, which includes a babaco for people who knows what those are, many cacti, things with that milky sap often like to form a callus before they get planted. That would mean leaving them out for 24 hours before popping them into potting mix. And that will just help prevent them from rotting, which they can be a little bit more prone to than some other plants. Oh, and Jen has just mentioned with fiddle leaf fig that you can propagate them from leaves, and that's another technique we didn't quite get around to today, but leaf propagation is a thing, and feel free to go and look that up, and that for some houseplants is a pretty common way of propagating them as well.
Cool. Well, I think that our questions have kind of come to a halt, so unless anyone's got any burning ones, I think we might finish up there and leave you to all go about your days and hopefully get out in the garden. It's quite beautiful and mild in Melbourne, 18 degrees. Cool, thumbs up. All right, well, thank you everyone, and hope to see you next weekend or sometime soon.